Welcome to the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast. I'm Greg Drevenstedt, Editor-in-Chief at Rider Magazine. Today's episode is sponsored by Fly Racing. Since 1998, Fly Racing has aimed to provide customers with the very best in off-road performance products. Led by the revolutionary Formula S Smart Helmet, Fly Racing continues to push innovation and safety to new levels. Never before has style and technology blended together so seamlessly as the 2024 Fly Racing lineup. For more info, check out flyracing.com or your local Western Powersports dealer. Follow at Fly Racing USA on social media and cheer for all your Fly Racing riders in the Super Motocross World Championship. On the show with me today is my friend and colleague Kevin Duke, who is the editor-in-chief at American Rider and also a contributing editor to Rider. So Duke, we just kicked off a new year. We're sort of, in January, and there are a lot of cool 2024 motorcycles, and that's what we want to talk about is bikes that have come out, bikes that we've ridden, some of the trends in new motorcycles these days. I was making a list for this show, and from Aprilia to Yamaha, there are over 70 new or updated motorcycles. Mostly we're talking about street bikes, anything with a license plate on it. So over 70 new or updated motorcycles have been announced for 2024. So yeah, that's a lot of bikes. And, you and I are lucky enough, we get to ride a lot of them. We may not ride all of them, but you and I have already ridden some of the 2024 bikes, and we'll get into some of that. But, before we get into specific models and bikes that we've ridden, I want to talk about some of the sort of general trends that are going on in motorcycles these days. And first and foremost, we have to talk about adventure or ADV bikes, which seem to sort of have taken over the market in some ways. What do you think? Why is that?
Well, adventure bikes are amazing. I think in the first generations of adventure bikes, there was a lot of compromises, right? It was like more to the street or more to the dirt. And now, these days, the adventure bikes can do anything, and they've kind of taken over sport touring. You put a seat up taller and you got more leg room. You put a bigger front wheel on and you can go to more places. And so it just opens up horizons. And there's seems to be less compromises. The Tiger 900 I rode a few weeks ago, there was a rally version and a GT version. And I like riding fast on the road, so I want a GT version. Except the rally version pretty much did everything the GT could do, and then we spent another day going off road on the rally version, and it's like, well, there's not a lot of compromises anymore. It's a fabulous market how it's expanded to include riders of all kinds, sport touring riders and the dual sport riders, and combine them into a neat package that doesn't offer a lot of compromises.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the SUVs and crossovers in the four-wheel world. I mean, those things have come to dominate the automotive market. You've got Lamborghini and Porsche and all of these performance car companies making SUVs, and a lot of people thought that that would never happen, but they sell every one they make. They have high margins on all of them. And the thing about adventure bikes is, of course, all the marketing is everybody's, flying off of dunes and they're roosting and they're basically doing all kinds of cool off-road stuff. When you get a professional motocross racer or something like that on an adventure bike, you see what they can do. But most people, it's kind of like with SUVs. 90% of them won't really leave the pavement, or if they do, it's just down a regular gravel road that you could take a Goldwing down.
And there's an attitude behind it, right? The people riding SUVs that look kind of off-roady and don't go off-road, they're still carrying around that attitude, right? Like, I can go anywhere.
Yeah, well, I mean, since the pandemic, everybody now has a bug-out vehicle. So they either got their four-wheel drive Sprinter van, or they've got their Tacoma with a rack and a rooftop tent, and they've got all of their, gas tanks and winches and everything like that. And the same thing in adventure bike world. People love to farkle out their bikes. They love to put on luggage and crash bars and lights. And I mean, if you've ever been on the freeway and you have somebody come up behind you on a GS and they've got Clearwater lights, it's like, it's like having somebody throw a spotlight on you, and it's even during the daytime. So, yeah.
It was interesting seeing the new 2024 Harley announcement, and they've got this CVO Pan America, right? And so the Pan America is a good adventure bike. But I had to chuckle a little bit when I heard Brad Richards say, nobody modifies adventure bikes like Harley customers. And I'm like, have you met a BMW customer?
Exactly, exactly. Well, speaking of that, so that was the CVOs were just the 2024 Harley Davidsons. They've got that CVO Pan America, which is a $28,400 adventure bike. So that's the thing about adventure bikes is, is some of them, there's a lot of tech on some of them. They can be very expensive. I mean, that one is outfitted with um, adaptive ride height. It's got a quick shifter. It's got luggage. It's got all the kind of stuff, accessories that you would want. It's got a cool paint job. Other bikes that Harley Davidson announced this week were really kind of in their wheelhouse. So it's an updated Street Glide, upgraded Road Glide, a CVO Road Glide ST, which is a hot rodded version of that bike. So, but before we get off on some of that, so the thing about adventure bikes, I'm with you. I'm fortunately, you have a shorter inseam than I do, but you've ridden a lot of bikes, and you're not put off by the tall seat heights. I've got a 34-inch inseam, and there's hardly a motorcycle that you can buy except for maybe some dirt bikes that I can't flat foot. But the thing is, so they have an upright seating position. They're really comfortable. They may not have the full wind protection of, say, a full boat sport tour. But the interesting thing is that the open class sport tour market has kind of, they haven't updated. Yamaha hasn't updated its FJR. Kawasaki hasn't done anything with the Concord 14 in a long time. Honda no longer makes the ST 1300. But a lot of the stuff, cool stuff that you would want on a motorcycle, for example, the very first production motorcycle to have cornering ABS, which is an absolutely fantastic safety feature, and it's available on a lot of bikes, was on the KTM 1190 Adventure 10 years ago. That was a Bosch designed technology. And I remember the first time I rode that bike, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go into a corner and try and just stab the brakes as hard as I can and hope I don't get pitched off this thing. And it took a while to sort of build up the nerve to do that. But that was the kind of thing that it used to be sport bikes where you were going to get the cool technology. We were going to get ride modes and traction control and a lot of those different things, which again, they're still highly sophisticated sport bikes that have all that stuff. But some of the first bikes to have radar assisted things like adaptive cruise control, blind spot detection. One of the first bikes that I think of was the Ducati Multistrada V4 was one of the first bikes to offer that kind of tech. And now you can get it on other adventure bikes as well.
And it's kind of interesting how the Pan America was the first bike with adaptive ride height, adjustable ride height, and you rode the BMW 1300 GS, and it's got that
Yeah.
technology. And it's
Yeah.
funny how Harley kind of became the leader in that feature.
I was, yeah, when the Pan America came out a couple of years ago, you and I both went to that press launch, and I think we were all pretty surprised at how well it worked. I mean, the thing is, it was anything that Harley Davidson one came out with an adventure bike that there were really no excuses or caveats. It wasn't like a Buell Ulysses. It didn't have belt drive. It didn't have any kind of funky technology. They benchmarked it against the leading adventure bikes from KTM, BMW, and so forth, and they came out with a fantastic bike right out of the gate. As far as I know, it's been one of the top selling adventure bikes in the US since it came out 2 years ago. But
Still,
like I said, they were, it's interesting because Harley Davidson makes mostly cruisers, and cruisers are known for their low seat heights, and that's something that
mhm.
people are very comfortable with. And so they were the ones who, again, they said, hey, we're going to do an adventure bike, but we don't want to exclude too many of our customers or potential customers. And so that adaptive ride height, which can lower, I think, the seat height by up to almost a couple of inches when you come to a stop, it works really, really well. And yeah, they were the first ones to do it. And then, like you said, BMW's got it. Triumph has added it to some of its Tigers. And it's going to be probably pretty commonplace on some of these adventure bikes because, I mean, a lot of our readers say most adventure bikes are just too dang tall for them.
Yeah, and Harley learned about 20 years ago that all their customers prefer their bikes with lower seat heights. And so that's why most of their bikes have really limited rear suspension travel. And so to have that ability to accommodate a shorter rider on a taller bike like an adventure bike, yeah, it makes all kinds of sense. But then it's going to add more cost to these bikes. And
Right.
I think we're going to be talking about technology, and these technologies add cost.
Yeah, you and I could obviously fill up a whole episode talking about adventure bikes, and we'll do that at a later episode. I mean, like I say, you mentioned the new R1300 GS, which is a ground up overhaul of that bike. It's fantastic. I rode it in Spain last fall. You're going to ride the new F900 GS in Spain next month. The new Transalp has been really popular. There's a new Moto Guzzi Stelvio. There's new V-Strom 800s. There's all kinds of bikes. So there are so many adventure bikes in the market that we really should just sort of focus on that at a later time. So we've talked about tech, we've talked about, radars and cornering ABS. So yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, what's common on a lot of motorcycles these days is throttle by wire. So it's no longer a cable, throttle. It's basically all done electronically. A lot of motorcycles have inertial measurement units, which are basically accelerometers, kind of like what's in your smartphone. It knows orientation in 6 axes.
Yep.
So how fast you're going and sort of yaw and pitch and all of those sorts of things. It kind of tells the engine control unit, what the motorcycle is doing in time and space, and that informs cornering ABS. It informs lean angle sensitive traction control, other things like wheelie control. It can do a lot of different things. Bikes have quick shifters now, so they can be up and down quick shifters where you don't have to use a clutch except for pulling away from a stop.
Right.
Semi-active suspension, which I know is one of our favorite features. It's basically the damping is managed again by sensors, stroke sensors, and IMUs in real time to adjust. It can stiffen up the fork so it doesn't dive so much on brake dive. It doesn't squat under acceleration. And then, of course, we've talked about some of this radar adaptive stuff. What do you think about all this technology that's on bikes these days?
Well, throttle by wire, when it came out, it was kind of a little bit, I wouldn't want to say glitchy, but it wasn't refined.
Right.
And but yeah, now throttle by wire, any bike can have electronic cruise control, right? It's You're not controlling a throttle tube, you're just controlling what the brain is telling the throttles to do. And then IMU, you talk about cornering ABS, that the IMUs and inertial measurement units are the things that make cornering ABS possible. And so more and more bikes are getting IMUs. Lots of bikes still don't have them. And so you can still have ABS, but you can't have cornering ABS. And you can still have traction control, but you can't have a highly refined traction control like you can with an IMU. So the IMU, even quick shifters, the IMUs, the Street Triple, which I rode last year, the previous version didn't have an IMU, and the quick shifter was good, but the IMU equipped Street Triple, the quick shifter was brilliant. It was flawless. And so even the IMUs can inform quick shifters of when and how best to shift using ride-by-wire throttles, right? So yeah, all this technology is making bikes better. I'd hate to be the person to pull it apart to try and fix it on a dusty roadside at midnight or whatever, but yeah, the bikes just keep getting better, and even the least desirable bikes are pretty good motorcycles these days. I
Yeah.
was talking at the Suzuki launch earlier this week, and I think journalists had it a lot easier in the old days because there was all kinds of things to complain. Now it's like you're nitpicking.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, to speak about some of this technology, I know that, it's particularly some readers that maybe a little bit, or viewers are a little bit old school. They're like, I don't need any of that stuff. I don't need ABS. I don't need any of this. Now, one of their concerns is perhaps complexity. It can make motorcycles more expensive to buy, can make them more expensive to work on if something isn't working. But I have to say is, you and I both have been on lots of press launches, ridden lots of motorcycles, and particularly in a lot of unusual places. You're riding them in another country on strange roads, on mountains, and surfaces can be wet, they can be sandy, they can be a lot of different things. And particularly cornering ABS is one of those features that I absolutely love it because I know it has saved my bacon a few times. And the thing is, what I don't think a lot of people realize is that anti-lock braking is basically just trying to prevent lockup, but it's mostly in a straight line. The way that cornering ABS works is that there's actually brake force, it can control brake force distribution where the motorcycles algorithms and sensors know that if you're leaned over, that you've given up a lot of traction by being on the side of the tire, and it will not allow the brake system to put too much braking force into the calipers in order to basically overwhelm that traction. So it is a fantastic safety feature. I mean, you can crash any motorcycle, but it's something that it not only limits lockup, but also brake force, which I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate.
Right, and you'd mentioned the KTM. I think that was the first bike with cornering ABS. And when I first heard about it, I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to just slam on the front brake in the corner while I'm leaned over at 30 degrees. I got to test out this rig that, kept you upright, and I could do that. And so, yes, you can slam on the front brake while you're leaned over at 30 degrees, and the bike does not lose traction. Like it's almost magical.
Yeah, yeah. Now, of course, again, you still need to know how to brake going into a corner and make sure you're braking hard enough to make a corner, do all those sorts of things. I think also one of the things that some people don't fully appreciate is a lot of these systems work in the background. Like, Corning ABS does not interfere with the riding experience. It doesn't make braking feel weird. Yes, old ABS systems, I mean, the earliest production bikes with ABS were BMWs back in the late 80s. And even in 90s and early 2000s, some of them, when you would apply the brakes pretty hard, you could feel it kind of pulsing. It was you could feel it kind of it was a little bit lurchy at certain
Absolutely.
times, but the systems have advanced so much that same with traction control. Traction control used to be one where, of course, that's limiting real wheel speed, so you're not spinning up the rear tire, possibly either sliding out, getting into a situation where you could fling yourself off in high side. But some traction control systems, it was almost like hitting a hard rev limiter. It would
Right.
be a rather abrupt, almost like hitting tilt on a pinball machine or something like that, if anybody remembers pinball machines. But like these days, the intervention is so subtle. I'm sure you've been on bike plenty of times where you basically just accelerate hard out of a corner. You don't, I would not necessarily feel any apparent slippage, but you'll see a traction control light flicker a little bit because it's applying just a little bit of input just to make sure that the wheel speeds are where they should be. So
Yeah, and you don't even notice it. You have to look at the gauges to know if traction control is engaging or not.
yeah,
That's how smooth it's become, especially with IMUs.
yeah. Yeah, like I say, I personally like anything that can add make a bigger safety net, wider margin of safety or something. I certainly welcome, because I know that I'm not a professional racer, never was, didn't race. Is that I know that it's the panic situation where I may not react
Right.
appropriately. I may overbrake. I may just freak out and grab too much of a front brake. Modern bikes have fantastic braking systems that are super powerful. So anything that would keep me from making a bad situation worse by overreacting, I think is a good thing. And again, it doesn't interfere with the ride.
As an older rider, I hate the idea of the bike overriding what I want it to do, except it's gotten seamless. Like even there's a whole bunch of bikes now that have electronic brake distribution where it'll add a little bit of rear brake when you're applying the front brake. And maybe the early systems you could sense that kind of intervention, but on the modern stuff, it's seamless. And so
Yeah,
there's been a couple of bikes I've ridden where I've learned it had electronic brake force distribution and not known about it. I've been riding the bike and it's like, what? It has that? I
right,
had no idea.
right,
You
right.
can feel it.
I mean, again, certain situations, people riding off road, sometimes people doing track days, they may not want any electronic intervention, any ABS or traction control. Particularly, I mean, we talked earlier about adventure bikes. Modern ABS systems, again, are often adapted quite well to the off environment where traction is very limited, where typically off-road ABS will keep ABS intervention on the front wheel. It will turn it off at the rear wheel so you can skid the rear wheel into a corner to to slow yourself down going down a hill or whatever it may be. But it reduces the amount of intervention in the front. And I actually like off-road ABS because, again, I'm not a great off-road rider. And again, you go into a corner and over brake, it's too easy to lose the front in an off-road situation. Again, it's not going to prevent it entirely, but every little extra bit helps. And so, yeah,
I wanted to be a Luddite, counting on my immense skills to control the bike,
right.
but I've given that up.
Yeah.
Give me the electronics. I just hope it doesn't break.
Yeah. Well, and even with the off-road, settings for traction control, most traction control systems have multiple settings that go from like kind of not, from a lot of intervention to very little. Is you can kind of set it where you can power slide out of a corner on a big, heavy, powerful adventure bike, but it's going to keep you from getting too carried away, because you can just bring that rear around too much. And so, yeah, it can save you from yourself if your skills are limited, your enthusiasm gets the better of you, or you're just in a kind of panic or a situation where you get kind of freaked out. So,
Yep. And for those old school riders, pretty much all the adventure bikes, you can turn that stuff off.
right.
So, don't not buy a bike because it has electronics. Most of it you can turn off or at least dial it way back so it doesn't really intrude.
Well, one thing that you and I haven't talked about much, we mentioned the adaptive ride height suspension on the Harley Davidson Pan America, and that it's on the BMW R 1300 GS, and I think the Triumph Tiger Explorers is available. Sometimes it's all these bikes. It's usually an option because it'll add $1,000 or $1,500 to the price. But semi-active suspension, which again, it's electronic solenoids and stepper motors and so forth that are adjusting damping rates in real time. Again, one of my most favorite features because every time that you have manual suspension set for even for a particular rider, it's always going to be a compromise. Is it going to be good for comfort? Is it going to be good for speed? And if you're on a bike where you're riding on the highway part of the time, the canyons part of the time, is a bike that the suspension damping can adapt to your whatever the situation is, or there may be modes that would for example, you rode the Suzuki GSX-S 1000 GX Plus, which is Suzuki's first bike with semi-active suspension. Has hard, medium, and soft modes, or a user mode where you can customize the suspension damping settings. So, what do you think?
Well, semi-active suspensions are great on any bike, but it's especially useful on adventure bikes, anything with a lot of suspension travel, because you get on the brakes and the bike wants to pitch a lot, or if you get on the power, it wants to pitch backward. Semi-active suspension keeps that uh, pitch angle more in control. And yeah, that GX Plus that I rode, I'm riding it in town. There's cobblestone streets and speed bumps, and I'm in soft mode and I'm super comfortable. And I get on the freeway and I'm super comfortable. And then we turn down into a canyon and I dial it up to sport, and then it feels like a tamped down sport bike in terms of suspension. It's it's instant. It's no kneeling down and figuring out which one's the rebound disc, which is the compression, and how much preload should I use if I use this much rebound damping. And yeah, press a button and it'll do it for you. And the GX also has you can finely tune it, so it's not just a global soft, medium, hard. You can also
Right.
fine tune it from there. And so, yeah, it's got to add some money to the cost, but especially on a long travel suspension, it's worth it. Totally love it.
Yeah, and one of my favorite features is not just the ability to adjust things with a push button, but chassis stability is one of the great features of semi-active suspension. Not just the comfort or being able to be hard versus soft, but is it can be set up to where it won't bikes won't dive under hard braking. They won't squat as much under acceleration. Remember when Ducati first did semi-active suspension on its multistradas, they had what was called Skyhook, which was an algorithm, and it used to this they had this schematic of sort of viewing the bike from above, and it was really what it's working in real time to try and keep the chassis as stable as possible. It's not getting out of shape. And again, when a chassis pitches too hard up or down, either direction, that can put extra forces into the tires. It can really compromise traction depending on what the situation is. So it can really help a bike feel really sure-footed. It feels really planted in all situations.
And for listeners who might not know, semi-active suspension. So an active suspension can actually raise or lower the wheels, and so all the systems on motorcycles are semi-active. So it's controlling the damping and keeping the bike more stable in terms of its suspension performance.
Right. Well, I mentioned Ducati, of course. One of the things that a lot of these bikes from a lot of these manufacturers, whether they're adventure bikes or some of these sport tours, like we were talking about the Suzuki GSX S 1000 GX Plus, there's the Yamaha Tracer 9 GT Plus. Both those bikes have semi-active suspension. A lot of these bikes have ride modes, and now a ride mode can be something as simple as a throttle response mode or a different engine map that can be more aggressive or more relaxed. A rain mode that's going to soften throttle response. But Ducati was one of the first to come out with what they called four bikes in one. When the Multistrada, the more modern version of it came out in 2010, they had a sport mode, a touring mode, an urban mode, and an enduro mode. And the systems were integrated where it would do throttle response, traction control, ABS, and if it has semi-active suspension, it'll have a mode. So each of these modes has all of the best settings from all of these different electronic features. And then, of course, most of them allow you to do some customization. Maybe they'll have a custom mode, or within any given mode, you can go in and dial in some of your preferences. But yeah, it can be as simple as switching from sport to off-road when you go from pavement to dirt.
Right, and there's no rejetting the carburetor for altitudes or
What's a carburetor? Well, speaking of carburetors, I know, so you were at the Suzuki GSX 8R launch this week. So that is Suzuki's, they came out with a new 776cc parallel twin last year that goes in the 8S naked bike, in the V-Strom 800 and 800DE adventure bikes. And then they've got a fully fared version of the sport bike called the 8R. And this week, you rode that on the street. You also rode it at Chuckwalla Raceway. So tell us about that, and then tell us about what is Suzuki's best-selling motorcycle.
Yeah, the 8R surprised me in its competency. It Suzuki gave us a chance to ride it on the street, and it was kind of cold and rainy, and couldn't get much lean angle. But it was like comfortable. It felt like a GT, like the GSXS 1000 GT. And so th this is kind of going the opposite way of the GX from the GT to the GX, in that it's a naked bike, but it's turned into a bit of a sport bike. But it's not a GSXR at all. It's like a GT. It's still very comfortable. Seats comfortable. The motor, that parallel twin Suzuki motor, it's a great usable piece of machinery. Uh, when we got to ride it on the racetrack, I felt it. I wished it had a little bit more top end power, and I think you've got an analog for that, which might explain that a bit more. But that Suzuki's a really nice bike. I think it looks great, and it's super usable. So, if you want to go do club racing, I guess there's a class for it, but there's sportier motorcycles. But this is a great way to have a sporty looking motorcycle and still be utilitarian and usable, and you could easily do sport touring on it.
Yeah. Well, and it retails for $9,000, right? 89.99.
94.39
Oh,
is the
94.39. Okay. Oh, it's the 8S that's 89.99. Yes. So
right.
yeah, so I have the naked bike, the 8S, in my garage now. I'm working on a comparison test between that and the CF Moto 800 NK, which is a 799cc parallel twin. We could also talk probably an entire episode about parallel twins and the rise of the parallel twin
Yeah.
on motorcycles these days, and how versatile they are. We'll come back to that. But so the 800 NK, CF Moto's really probably one of the first Chinese manufacturers to become a mainstream brand. They've really come on strong with a full lineup in the last couple of years. But they've had a partnership agreement with KTM for a number of years, and they're actually they build some engines for KTM. They build some motorcycles, like they build the 790 Adventure, to give them the production capacity. But the part of the partnership agreement between CF Moto and KTM is this 800 NK uses this KTM 790 motor. It was designed and tested by KTM in Austria, and then they were allowed to put that in the CF Moto bikes, because that is the absolute most expensive part of developing a motorcycle, is developing an engine from scratch. You've got to design it and test it under all kinds of conditions. It's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions. And so the interesting thing is, you were talking about how the Suzuki, the 8R, feels a little bit strangled at the top end. So we put both the GSX 8S, so essentially the same bike as the R, but without a fairing, and the 800 NK on the dyno at Jet Tuning. And so above, they're pretty similar up to about 6,000 RPM, but then the 8S tops out at about 76 horsepower. Both of them rev out to about 10,000 RPM, but the 800 NK goes up to 93 horsepower. So it's nearly 20 horsepower more, and it also makes a bit more torque, but it really just sort of leaves the Suzuki behind as you get into the higher revs. And it's really, I mean, that's all about tuning. It's just, it feels, it's like a little bit of a lumpier cam and a little bit more of a lively engine than the 8S has. So
Yeah, the Suzuki definitely feels more refined than that KTM motor or the one that's in the CF Moto. So yeah, if you're looking for horsepower, that's an easy choice. But if you're looking for something that's gonna still be running without any issues after 30,000 miles, I'd put my money on the Suzuki.
Well, you were talking about earlier about it's got this cross balancer system that's got dual counterbalancer, so it's really smooth. It's not smooth to the point of dullness, but it's the sort of thing where vibration is the enemy of any vehicle, in terms of longevity, and so managing that vibration is pretty important. So
Two quick things to tie that one up. First is when I'm at the racetrack, I got on the bike for our first session, and I didn't realize the bike was running when I got on it. The Suzuki guys had started it up, and you put earplugs in your helmet, and I had no idea it was running. Like, not only could I not hear it, I couldn't feel it. It is so relatively smooth. And I asked the Suzuki engineers, I said, I wish this bike was a bit louder. Are you building it right to the limit of what the EPA will let you get away with? And they said yes. And I said, well, how come, it's so quiet relative to other bikes? And he says, well, maybe the other companies are cheating.
yeah. Well, that's the thing is, a lot of motorcycles have got to meet, sound standards or sound regulations for the EPA.
Yeah.
Can't sell them in the United States unless they do that. And so we've talked about the tech of some of these bikes and how that makes bikes sophisticated and cool and versatile and all that stuff, and we love them. But it's also added to the sticker price. You
Yeah.
mentioned the Suzuki GSX-S 1000 GX Plus, which is the most expensive Suzuki you can buy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's nearly $19,000.
Yeah. Pushing 20. And to a lot of riders, I've had people say to me afterwards, as God, that's Ducati territory or KTM territory. And it's like, well, if you want all the good stuff, it's going to cost money. And the COVID thing and supply chains, it seemed like manufacturers were kind of just arbitrarily boosting their prices and adding certain fees. There's like supply chain fees from some brands, and yeah, bikes are getting expensive, but what isn't getting expensive?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're right. I mean, whenever you go to a manufacturer's website, there's always the base price. But then there's things, there's freight, there's destination, there's setup charges, and these can add hundreds of dollars to the bottom line. And some of this stuff is charges that dealers, because they got to get the bike out of the crate and they got to set it up in order for you to take it away and so forth. But they've tacked on quite a few of these charges that didn't used to be there, and so it's making expensive bikes even more expensive.
Yeah, it's tough for consumers, except any bike you pick is going to be a good one. And so, I want the new one.
Well, at the opposite end of the market, yes, a lot of bikes have gotten more sophisticated, but I think there's a lot of cool smaller bikes on the market. Aprilia, they came out with their RS 660 sport bike with a parallel twin a couple of years ago. There's an RS 457 version that they haven't released a lot of details about, but it's a 457cc, presumably parallel twin. It's 6799. We mentioned CF Moto. They've got a 450 NK. So that NK usually means naked bike. They also have an SS version of it that's with a full fairing. That's 5399.
Bad.
Also for 2024, Kawasaki brought back the Eliminator. Years ago, the Eliminator was a cruiser with a Ninja 900 motor in it. They went small, and there were different versions of the Eliminator, but the one they brought back is they took the Ninja 400 engine, added some more stroke to it, so it's now a 451cc parallel twin. Put it in what's basically kind of a sport cruiser. It's kind of like looks sort of like would be a competitor with the Honda Rebel 500.
Yeah.
That's 66, 50 to buy one of those. They just announced this week new using the same 451cc parallel twin. There's a Ninja 500 and then a Z500 naked bike. Those bikes, start at just over $5,000. This weekend, or the last weekend of January, our associate editor Allison is going to Spain to ride two new Triumphs, their first small displacement bikes of the modern Triumph era. She's going to ride the Speed 400 which is $49.95, and then the Scrambler 400X, which is $5,600. So those have a brand new 398cc parallel twin. No, they're
Right.
singles. I'm sorry, it's a single.
Single, yeah.
Um, so what do you think of all the smaller bikes on the market?
I'm a big fan. There used to be this stigma against smaller bikes, like yeah, they're not manly enough for me, or whatever. And I had a really great experience on a long-term KTM 390 Duke. I had
I love that bike.
Yep. And I rode it out to Chuckwalla, so a 3 hour crappy freeway ride. And I did a track day on it, ripped around on the track all day, and then rode it home. And the thing is fast. Like, it's not as fast as, bigger displacement bikes, but certainly plenty enough for entertainment. And that 390 Duke, and I bet you this Triumph 400, that'll outpower a Triumph 650 from the old days, right? When
Sure.
that was a
Yeah.
badass machine. And now it's a single cylinder bike and it'll provide plenty of entertainment and there's no problem pulling 90 miles an hour down the freeway if that's how fast you want to go. And if you can get them for 4, 5, 6 grand, that's a lot of value there
Yeah.
that we always think we want the next step up, and sometimes you don't really need it.
Well, I'm going to be going to Spain next month for 2024 KTM celebrating 30th anniversary, 30 years of the Duke line. So they've got a new 250 Duke, which replaces the 200 Duke. They've got an updated 390 Duke. They've got a 990 Duke. And then at the top of the food chain, they've gone from the 1290 to the 1390 Super Duke R Evo.
There you
Um,
go. Step up.
and 1350 cc's, 188 horsepower. So we're going to be riding these bikes on the street and the track. But I have to say, I mean, I've ridden a 390 Duke. It's been usually about right at about $5,000. It's got throttle by wire. It's got a TFT display. It's got ABS. I mean, it it's a lot of bang for the buck, and it's absolutely a blast to ride. I mean, there's that saying, it's always more fun to ride a slow bike fast than a fast bike slow.
So
Is
true.
that when you know that a bike only has so much power, you can actually you can play with its limits, in terms of how fast you can get into cornering speed, and so forth. Whereas a lot of bikes that are just, I don't want to say too powerful for the street, but you really can't utilize their full capabilities on the street. And most people don't have the skill to even really utilize their full capabilities on the track.
Yeah, and some of the enjoyment about riding a motorcycle is like twisting its tail hard. And on a 1390 Duke or a Ducati Street Fighter, if you hold the throttle pinned for 2 seconds, you are breaking laws. Like there's just no other way to get around it. They're so fast that you will be past 60 and past 80 and past 100 in no time. And there's something really satisfying about feeling the end of that throttle cable or the electronic throttle cable and know
Exactly.
that you're getting everything you can out of a motorcycle. And yeah, there's still lots of enjoyment in small bikes.
I agree. I always have fun riding them. Like I said, there's going to be some cool ones we've had some, we've got tests of the Eliminator on our website. Allison rode that one. We look forward to hearing her feedback on riding the Speed 400 and the Scrambler 400X. So speaking of Triumph, there's one more thing I want to talk about. Obviously, we got a lot of bikes to talk about. We'll come back and do another episode or two. We're definitely going to do one just about adventure bikes, but announced for 2024, Triumph has a dirt bike. It's the TF250X. It's a 250cc motocross bike. They have, the GOAT Ricky Carmichael helped develop that bike, as well as Ivan Cervantes, who has also won a bunch of racing, off-road races. Is Those guys helped develop that bike, and it's going to compete in, I think, probably the world GP of or the GP of motocross. I'm not sure what their sort of race teams are going to do, but why would Triumph come out with a dirt bike?
Well, I imagine to flex their engineering might. The problem Triumph has with that, and Ducati is also developing a 450 motocrosser, is that, okay, so the state of the art is already elevated, right? The difference between a Kawasaki and a Suzuki and a Honda, there's not much in it. So you got to spend money on the best rider, and that's million or millions of dollars. And then once you've got that bike finished, then you got to start developing the next one because everybody else is working on their next one. So rather than a bike that you can, like the the K5 Suzuki motor, the vaunted K5 Suzuki. It came out in 2005 in the GSX-R 1000, and it's used in that GX Plus and the GT and other bikes from Suzuki. So you get a lot of amortization of your investment on that. When you're in the motocross world and you're competing at the highest levels, the development never stops. It's got to keep on going. So for Suzuki or for Ducati and Triumph to be playing in that market, and that market is mostly just North America. They sell motocross bikes in Europe too, but riding areas are really restricted, so it's mostly here. So there's a lot of investment. The R&D and then the riders to show it well, right? Having a new Triumph or a Ducati competing in Supercross doesn't mean anything if you're running in 12th. So you got to spend money on the best rider. And so they're spending a ton of money on this. And I wonder if I was the CEO, I'd be saying, yeah, let's sign that check. And the counter to that is you had mentioned the Suzuki's best-selling motorcycle. I
Right.
was talking to the Suzuki guys earlier this week, and I asked, "What's the best-selling Suzuki motorcycle?" And they said, globally, the best-selling motorcycle is the DR650. Now, I don't know when the last time you rode a DR650 is, Greg, but it's been years and years for me. But that thing's been around since 1990. Maybe some mild updates, but it's
Yeah.
essentially the same motorcycle. And they're 30 some years later, they're still selling it and in big numbers. And so when you look at what Suzuki's doing with sales of a DR650 and you think of what Ducati and Triumph are going to have to do with sales of their dirt bikes, the supercross, motocross bikes,
Right.
but yeah, good, difficult business case to make in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, DR650 is still carbureted. It's sort of like the Honda XR650L. That was a big deal a couple of years ago when Kawasaki decided to put their fuel injection on their KLR 650 because it had also been unchanged for years. Yeah, those bulletproof dual sport bikes, they paid for themselves and the tooling and everything, decades ago, it seems
Yeah,
like, and they're still making money off them. And the funny thing is, buy them new. They're not really that cheap. There's zillions of them on the market used that are pretty darn affordable, but they're not really dirt cheap to go in and just buy one, even though, like I said, they're going to make money off of every one. So yeah, the dirt bike thing with Triumph, I mean, for them to get into that, good for them. More power, more brands or more manufacturers in any competition is a good thing. But man, going up against companies like KTM and Husqvarna, the big four of Japan, I mean, they've been in this game for a long, long time, and they've got a lot of money tied up in it. So yeah, they're jumping right into the deep end of the pool, and like I say, wish them luck, but it's going to be challenging. It will be.
yeah. I don't see how they're going to raise the game just on the bike. Oh, anybody who's riding the Triumph is going to win because the bike's so much better than the bike Honda's been refining for 40 years, right?
Right. Right. Well, we just scratched the surface of the 74 or so new and updated motorcycles for 2024. We talked about a lot of general topics and trends. We'll certainly get into the weeds with some of these bikes because in another episode. So I really appreciate everybody listening, Duke. It's always fun to chat with you, talk about bikes. I'd rather us be at a bar with the beers in our hand rather than on a Zoom call. But I know you've ridden a lot of these bikes. So real quick, one of the 2024 bikes that you rode earlier last year was like in last winter or spring. It was called a 2024, but it was in early 2023. What is that bike?
That's the Triumph Street Triple R, which retails for 10 grand, 99.99. And boy, it's a European semi-exotic bike that is great on the road. It turned out to be great on the Jerez racetrack, too. And so, it's European, it's kind of special, and it's very utilitarian. You could use it for commuting, you could use it for sport touring, and you can use it for track days. So the value proposition for me, that Street Triple 765R is almost unbeatable.
Almost unbeatable. Wow, that's saying a lot because I know you've ridden hundreds and hundreds of motorcycles, and yeah. So one of the things about those Triumphs is, they're known for their inline triples. Those are sweet, sweet engines. They're very
Mhm.
unique in terms of character. Kind of striking the balance between an inline four and maybe a V twin. The 765R makes 118 horsepower, so It's a middleweight bike that's really got a lot of get up and go. I unfortunately haven't ridden it yet. I'm glad that you got a chance to ride it, and you've been extolling its virtues ever since. So, and that's the thing, like, we talked about, 20, $30,000 adventure bikes, and some of the CVOs that Harley announced this week are 40,000 plus, and a lot goes into their paint jobs, and they're all decked out with stuff. But you can still buy an absolutely fantastic motorcycle for 10 grand or less. We talked about some of the small bikes, but you're talking about a 765cc bikes, plenty of size, power. It's a naked bike, so it's not going to do lots of touring on it like you could with other bikes, but again, a all around fun, useful, looks cool, blast to ride, 10 grand.
Yeah, and when it comes to technology and the latest bikes, sure, I'm happy to ride your 25,
Exactly.
$30,000 bike. Just don't ask me to buy it.
Yeah.
A 10 grand, that's more in my price range, and that sounds like a fun time to me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time, Duke. For the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast, I'm Greg Drevenstead. Thanks for listening, and keep the rubber side down. If you've enjoyed listening to the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast, please subscribe, leave us a positive rating, and tell your friends. We also encourage you to visit ridermagazine.com, where you can get the latest in motorcycle news and reviews and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. You can also subscribe to print and digital editions of Rider Magazine, which is published 12 times a year. Thanks again for listening.